Hello and welcome to Roguelike Radio. This is episode 49 where we're interviewing Tarn Adams, creator of Dwarf Fortress. Talking today we have
Tarn Adams,
John Harris,
and Darren Grey. Thank you very much for joining the show, Tarn. It's good to speak to you. You're pretty legendary in roguelike circles and indeed in sort of independent gaming circles as a whole. For those that don't know, Dwarf Fortress is the massive simulationist dwarf murdering game which uses ASCII-ish characters and procedural worlds, much in the way roguelikes do, to create a very complex and in-depth game. The thing that interests me about Dwarf Fortress is that there are so very, very many people who are developing roguelikes who have tried to make what they call the perfect roguelike, the ultimate simulationist roguelike. And you're the only one who's actually succeeded at this time. Everyone else collapses under the weight of their own projects, or runs out of steam, or it just disappears. They announce all their big plans and then eventually they just disappear with their engine half finished. Do you have any insight into why you have succeeded where so many others have failed?
Well, I mean, half finished is more than I've got. So it's we're only a third of the way through the stated goals, and the stated goals list, I mean, it just gets longer. So we're probably getting less and less finished over time. But it's I mean, I can't really say as why projects fall. And I mean, I've got a massive graveyard of 1,000 dead projects myself, and I've been doing this for more than 20 years now, so it was about time for one of them to survive as long as it survived, I think. And I just learned about the pitfalls that you can get into with programming and design, and arguably have escaped some of them, and some of them I've got ongoing problems with, but it's still kicking anyway.
Do you think there's an element of bloody-minded persistency in the face of failure?
Yeah, that's really a huge part of what it is. I've got it to the point now where I've left my job, so there's this whole element of staring the failing of my finances and so on right in the face that helps a bit. But really, just fixing bugs. You're not going to be a successful programmer if you don't get to that point where you can say, I've got some kind of horrible crash bug, I have absolutely no idea what's causing it, and I'm going to work for weeks if necessary just to squash one bug, and it just starts to become a habit, and you just keep plugging away at things. So yeah, you have to develop that kind of tenacity.
As I understand, you started 10 years ago in 2002 on Dwarf Fortress.
That's right. It was originally I was working on I've kind of been working forever on just the fantasy game, like the big dream fantasy game or whatever, where we started with this kind of text, not as in ASCII text characters graphical interface of text moving around, but actual text just scrolling up the bottom of the screen, just this kind of combat simulator where you'd go through a series of combats back in the early 90s, and kind of that game got a little world map and so on, and it was just this very proto thing that we had going basically the whole time, and that eventually turned into the first Slaves to Armok, which really doesn't have any relation to Dwarf Fortress at all, but it's just the Slaves to Armok name popped up there because the full name of Dwarf Fortress is Slaves to Armok, God of Blood, Chapter 2, Dwarf Fortress, and it's
not worthy of an anime.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. So we were working on that, and it was not going perfectly well. We released the first version in 2000 online, when there was an online to release things on, and I had some time in school. I put it up, and it was just kind of this, the first Slaves to Armok was maybe the sixth iteration of this concept of just kind of having a project die on us. Here's another one. And Armok was still kind of going full strength in 2002, when we had been doing a bunch of side projects. We put out these really bad games on our website, check them out. And were just these little joke side projects we put out. And we were working on another one, which was called Mutant Miner, which I don't know who played VGA Miner in here. It's just this little game where you go down the elevator and dig for gold. It's this little turn-based thing, which it's got kind of this randomly generated earth with minerals in it, and you go down the elevator and dig, and there's hazards and so on, and ultimately you want to get to the point where I think you're putting dynamite under a outhouse so you can get your wedding ring back or something like that. It's some very weird story, but you have this VGA Miner game, and just completely at random we're like, okay, let's be inspired by that and have a little turn-based mining game where you dig down and get canisters of mutagen to grow extra arms so that you can mine faster and fight monsters and stuff. And that was this weird side project that was so strange. I don't think he was even heading for a release as a joke project. It was just another little side project because you always have to have extra things going. And that game failed miserably. We felt like we needed to add extra miners just for no reason. And then you were doing a turn-based multiple party of miners climbing down, and it was as slow as an SSI game, but without the fun of having combat, like an old Pool of Radiance type game. So you'd be moving these guys around, like mining one square at a time, and it was just bad. And so that project, we kind of started rethinking it. We're like, this really needs to be real time to have this many guys moving around doing things that aren't necessarily tactical and thoughtful, where you'd want to think about every move. So we made this real time game, and at the same time had the idea. When I say we, I'll go into that. That's my brother and I kind of plan everything out together. So we have this real-time game now, and we think we're just going to switch it over to dwarves, drop the whole mutant thing, and we also have the idea of having like an adventurer come in afterward to your fortress, which would always fail and act as kind of a high score list mechanism. And by finding like diaries and production notes, you'd kind of get a score, because you'd have your maximum score would be determined by how good your fortress was. And then your actual score would be determined by how good the kind of roguelike game you played afterward would be in terms of discovering in the face of hazards and kind of various Moria type hazards, what things you actually discovered about your fortress. So if you discovered the full potential of your fortress, you'd achieve the maximum score that you had set out for yourself in the first part of the game. Just kind of this really weird idea that we thought would work well as one of these sort of semi-serious, not serious side projects that we'd release. It'd be done in 2 months. We started in October, I think, 2002, and it was going to be out by Christmas, just like the war was going to end. And because it's so fun, as you all know, to work on roguelike games and so on, and to work on games in general, it started siphoning out a lot of the good ideas from Armok, a lot of the things you'd start to recognize as being Dwarf Fortress, just this kind of meticulous stuff. And it just slowly grew over that time, working on and on and off, because we were still working very hard on Armok 1, which was this 3D, not in the sense of having different Z levels you look at in Dwarf Fortress, but actual 3D models. It would take us, months to just get a tree in place. Not that I'm doing much better with the trees now in Dwarf Fortress, taking about 2 weeks to do them, but you'd get trees, and then you'd get one creature in, and then you'd get two, maybe 12 creatures by the time, it was 4 years in. So it was starting to collapse of its own weight, just like all of the ones before it, just bad coding practices, that kind of thing. And the fact that it was a graphical game I had no business getting into, like having your guy had a randomly generated face, and it showed his different facial features, kind of like a bad version of what you get in those Bethesda games when you make your own face, or The Sims or something. And if you lost your eye, the eye would disappear from the model. And if you got your skin stripped off by one of the horrible spells we had, or you had one of your organs teleported out, they'd actually disappear from the model, and so on. And you can see how kind of Dwarf Fortress style mechanics in that environment would just slow everything down. And at the same time, Dwarf Fortress was being written, just stealing these mechanics, and not the specific ones, but just the general idea, and running super, super, super fast ahead, getting done very quickly. And so eventually it won. And we kind of announced the end of Armok 1, and Dwarf Fortress stole the name of Armok at that point, became Chapter 2, because we had maybe 100 fans, kind of just seeing where Armok would go at that point. They weren't actually, playing it too much, most of them, because it wasn't playable, but just very interested in seeing, kind of like you were saying, another one of these dream projects. How is this one going to die or whatever, right? And just kind of watching that. And so we wanted to have a sense of continuity there, so people knew we didn't, we weren't giving up on any of the ideas and kind of just going full steam ahead on the same project, basically, but without any graphics. And so that was maybe 2004, 2005, we announced that. And then in August of 2006, we finally got the first playable version out. That was the public release in 2006.
I don't know. I think you should go back to the idea of sort of a 3D dismemberment simulator.
Well, there's so many now, like Torabash and stuff. I think it's called, where you break people's limbs off and they fly through the air. So that now we've got specialists working in the field of 3D dismemberment, and we've just got our own little. We've got 3D projectile body parts and stuff. I mean, we've still got a little element of that.
It's like, I think of Dwarf Fortress as a mechanism by which dwarves are created and then killed.
So the reason for dwarves, I mean, everyone loves dwarves, but from what you said there, the reason for dwarves was just because initially it was mining, and obviously dwarves plus mining is a no-brainer in a way. Or did you have specific love of dwarves yourself?
No, we've been cultivating our love of dwarves. It was really just a kind of the mining coupled with it's hard to remember now if the adventure mechanic or the dwarves came first. I don't think there was any idea of ever having an adventure exploring the mutant miner scenario. So they probably developed around the same time, because the last thing we needed at that point was another kind of generic fantasy game, right? We were already working on one that was sucking away all of our time. And if you look at our other projects, they're like in the present day or World War I or whatever. They're not fantasy projects for the most part. I really don't know why it was dwarves at this point. We didn't have a particular fascination with them. But like you say, it's like mining, dwarves. If you're gonna make a fantasy game, that's the proper selection. And we were aware at the whole point of the Moria Balrog connection, because we always wanted the thing to die. You need it to die to get the adventure in there. So that could have been what drove that decision.
I like the sort of verisimilitude, sort of like the idea of dungeons in fantasy adventure game, where it's really kind of an artificial thing. I mean, the old school dungeons from the early days of D&D are these blatantly artificial things that could never have, they don't make sense logically. All these monsters somehow staying alive underground, waiting for adventurers to walk in. I like the idea of, sort of creating a structure like that through play, and then you can use that data as the basis for another game. A really complicated version of the roguelike dungeon generator.
Yeah, we were really that's one of the main things we were going for, because we love themed dungeons. We love when it makes sense what's in a dungeon. That's one of the reasons we like the parts of Crawl where you go into a side passage and then now you're in the snake pits or whatever, right? It's like an area where things are going to make, well, sense might be the wrong word, but it works together. And so when we have your Dwarf Fortress, when it's abandoned, the things that take it over, ideally, that's going to be what you're fighting against. If you go to another ruin in our game, it's always going to be something that's related to what happened in the world or why it's destroyed. I mean, we're still working on that, except when there's the whole wizard did it thing, and we do have a few wizards doing a few things. Like we have these zombie towers that are created by necromancers, and a wizard did them, and they make about that much sense. But at least the wizard will still be there, and you can kill him if you want.
This is a side thing, just real quick. There is this pen and paper solitaire game called How to Host a Dungeon that I ran into a few months ago. And it plays a lot like sort of, I guess, a really abstracted, very simplified version of Dwarf Fortress. But you do it all with counters on graph paper. And I thought it was very interesting, but it just reminded me of all this. Anyway. Yeah,
no, I like those. So I remember this one you can play with a deck of cards. You just kind of have different rules where the spades are potions and the clubs are monsters or something like that, and the hearts are like healing potions or something, and the diamonds are treasures, and you can kind of play this little solitaire with your game with yourself. Yeah, that's it's just another random thing while we're randomly being reminded of things. Uh,
That sounds interesting, actually. I gotta do a search for that later.
Just going back to sort of the early days, were you specifically influenced by any roguelikes?
oh yeah, it's hard to get my head around what the very first kind of memories were, and since we knew her, was coming on this show, I was just talking to Zach about this, like what was the first one? Because we played games that we actually had to type in from magazines, and there's things like Telengard and like the D&D type games where you could only see one square around you that were pretty old. And I know Rogue is originally from the 70s or whatever, but our first encounter with Rogue was the Epix Rogue because we actually had the box and I've still got the manual sitting around. It's covered with the brown stains of unknown origin. So there's a much cleaner manual. Sure. And we had Hack 1.03 that we got from downloading it off the bulletin boards. And I know that the Hack was our standard unit for how long it was going to take to download something, because I think it was something like 100 or 200,000 bytes, and that took like an hour to download at the speed we were downloading. Wow. So we always talked about hack units. It would take like half a hack unit or 2 hack units to download this or that file. So we had that one. I know we had Moria a little later because I remember the monster memory, but that was a little later. And we had Larn. That we also got off the bulletin boards. That was another fun one. So we had all these kind of dungeon crawling games. We probably played Hack the most out of those 4. Maybe Moria started tying with it when we got that one later because the monster memory is so fun to build up. But yeah, those were really influential. I think on our overall style, not just the fact that we got kind of procedurally generated everything, and that came from a lot of different places. I'd say mainly the roguelikes, but also games like Starflight and SimEarth with the kind of generation of worlds and so on was something that was very interesting. This is all when we were kids, so it's hard to, it's like a soup of ideas, right? So it's hard to kind of say what the exact influences are in amounts and so on. But also a big thing with Hack was the bones files, this kind of persistence of your old games and how they influence the future games and so on. That was really made us kind of shape part of our philosophy of writing games, I think.
Bones files, I think, are one of the great unexplored ideas. I mean, there's so much potential there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to us, the whole world is a bones file. That's kind of how we think about Dwarf Fortress. So, I mean, that's to the extent that it's kind of a generalization, and we've got retired characters that you can meet in adventure mode. You can retire your character, and your character will just go to live in the place, and you can have another character grab them for an adventure or call them out, start a war between the civilizations. Like if you started an adventure in one civilization and retire them, and then start a second adventure in another civilization, and you start fighting, you can actually cause a bit of a kerfuffle overall as a standard bearer of your civilization. All of that you can kind of think of as being heavily influenced by bones files.
Oh, I'm just going to bring up the NetHack utility Hearth, which is basically an automated way of sharing your bones files with other players, so that you can encounter bones from people you've never met with all kinds of unexpected situations in them.
Yeah, that's I've heard of that. I never used it, but that's really cool. That's kind of the we've got kind of multiplayer things like that going on, although I mean we're pretty bad about encouraging multiplayer uses of our game just because we have very little experience with that stuff ourselves. But people pass around worlds and play these kind of succession games. But it'd be funny if there was some kind of repository for worlds that you could randomly kind of pull down sites. And we don't really have a way to move sites between worlds because there's so much kind of data that links a site into its own world. That it's difficult to move them if it didn't know they were kind of pure vanilla Dwarf Fortress without any modifications. But yeah, it's intriguing, all these things that you can do.
Maybe like someone could create like a really big world and pass it around, have everyone start their own fortress in a different part of that world. I don't know. This is
They tried some cool stuff, and never really I haven't heard of one really getting off the ground. People try and kind of create this park for adventurers where everyone plays a really small fort on the same tile, but next to the old fort. So you'd kind of build up these little 2x2 blocks that build overall into like a larger, say, 8x8 block, which would already be like 16 fortresses or something. And then you've got this crazy world for an adventurer to walk around in. You just need the will and the people. I think the main thing holding it back is just kind of the young nature of adventure mode, that you don't get the full payoff just because adventure mode is not come into kind of sort of full flower yet, the same way that dwarf mode has with a lot of people.
Adventure mode has had some significant upgrades lately, and there is quite a huge amount of content to be found there. If you go digging around now, it's sort of the randomly created worlds have a surprising amount of depth, actually. But it's interesting, this whole setup, because you've got the main Dwarf Fortress, which is what everyone plays, really. When they think of Dwarf Fortress, that's what they think of. Which is kind of bridging this gap between roguelikes and the more sim-type games or civilization-type games. This other big area of procedural content, it's kind of meshing them together. Yeah, the adventure mode is quite interesting, because it's quite clearly a pure roguelike in terms of its gameplay. But it's so much more simulationist than any other roguelike out there. Yeah, it's quite cool in a lot of the interactions you can have, and very surprising, and it has this sense of, as Dwarf Fortress has, you can interpret all these sort of cool stories from what you've done in the game. It's one of those ones that it's almost more fun to talk about than to play. Because, the play itself, it has interface issues, I think.
That's true.
Might be
That's
fair
true.
to say. The combat kind of ends up like very long lists. Shall I attack their right arm with my left hand, or you got to go through these lists, and it's kind of
Well, you have the option to avoid the lists if you like, and just choose the optimal move.
But then you're kind of missing out on some of the complexity, which is sort of, how do you balance all this complexity with? It's hard to find the balance, because this is the big problem with Dwarf Fortress in general, in a way, is that there's so much complexity, but to be able to have that complexity, you need a really tricky interface. It's necessary, otherwise you have to dumb down the game. But it's interesting as a game, though, because there are several people very, very into it, and they have a lot of fun going about adventure mode, even without exploring the real fortresses, just generating a random world and having fun with the different quests and the different interactions and the crazy combat, and getting together a big group of followers, and you end up wielding people's corpses and all sorts of different things, and there's so many interactions that there's fun to be had there.
I remember an adventure mode story I had read in which someone threw a bunch of fluffy warblers, I think, that were at a bronze colossus, and exploded the thing's head with these little bunny-like creatures.
Yeah, projectiles are notoriously broken, even if the projectile is a living thing. So when you get to the vermin are small enough, and fluffy womblers are considered a vermin object. They're small enough that they get treated as an item, and so instead of calling the regular unit collision code, it's just like, okay, this is an item hitting, and so you start getting all the skill bonuses and material bugs that kick in. So yeah, you can be good at throwing a fluffy wobbler and just nail someone and blow their head off or whatever. Yeah, it's got all kinds of problems like that.
But it's got this whole material simulation thing, which there are no strict interactions. There is, depending on how the materials interact with each other, and depending on what lucky dice rolls you can get some really strange, crazy stuff. Like you can try and grab someone's head, and you scratch them whilst grabbing them, but you get a critical scratch which breaks through their skull and tears their brain out just from grabbing at their head. And it's the lucky dice roll with the material interactions can have that happen.
Yeah, most of that can be chalked up to just problems and errors, as far as I'm concerned. It's like because we tend to. They have the kind of, I don't remember if it was someone can remind me who said it, when you say that if it's realism or fun should win every time. It was one of the major guys. Is it Warren Spector? Is that one of the guys? I think it might have been him. It said something like that, and I think you don't disagree with that, because the way that the statement is stated that you're choosing between non-fun realism or fun non-realism, right? I mean, the choice makes itself through the formation of the quotation, so it's kind of a tautology. So what our philosophy is, of course, we want the game to be fun, but we're using realism to guide us toward where we think that's going to be. And if we don't have kind of our Occam's razor, you want to go with it sort of works out the opposite of Occam's razor, where you want to go with the simplest answer to your problem or whatever. For us, we want to try, if we don't have a better idea, we go with the realistic solution to our problem, and that ends up usually being the most complicated too. Yeah. So we've got this messy combat system where the reason that the fingernail scratch gets through the skull is because it's using too much force, and then it's using the sheer power of a nail against bone. And if it says that keratin is roughly as hard as bone, then it's like you're using a giant heavy keratin spear and stabbing someone in the face. And so you've just got to get the numbers right. And a lot of mods actually go about correcting, some fallacious numbers that we have to make things more realistic, or less, as the case may be.
I mean, it's interesting. You've got simulation as design. A lot of games, the approach is sort of, the player interaction, the player experience. But, the core part of Dwarf Fortress is simulation. Out of that, many good things can happen.
We'd like to arrive. I mean, simulation is where we're at now, where we're building up the game, and our hope has always been from the beginning to switch gears into storytelling once you have enough meat. These kind of really impossible problems of procedural narrative generation and so on. I want to make a storytelling game or whatever, but if you don't have a world to play with, then you make a lot of artificial decisions when you're doing that. Now that we've got all this stuff sitting around, we're actually starting to switch gears. In the next release, there's going to be a great deal more sort of world activity, people running around, people making decisions, you getting caught in the way of invasions and that kind of thing. It's still very sort of blocky in the sense that, yes, the goblins are raising that city and putting a bunch of heads on pikes, and yeah, that is the guy you bought your sword from, and there's his head or whatever, but it's not subtle. It's not like political or anything right now. Or we're slowly working toward that now that we've got all this meat to work with. But it's like we're not trying to build a simulation for its own sake. That's really not the goal here. We've always been interested in situations that arise and being able to follow a long storyline and so on. That's really what we're trying to get at. But we've always, or at least we've come to the conclusion that you just need to have a lot of stuff to have a shot at doing that. Not to say that you can't have like a story-based game that comes from a smaller thing, or that you can't. I mean, obviously the kind of after-action reports that you see from games that aren't trying to fill themselves with years and years of simulationists say that you can tell a good story, and you can certainly cause a player to tell a good story, but just the kinds of stories we were interested in telling, like a basically a cheap fantasy novel, some kind of Conan-esque story that, not to put Robert E. Howard down because he's awesome. So it's just, what I mean, though, a story like that.
It's interesting with a lot of games try to have some sort of procedural story. I think one area that Dwarf Fortress, the main mode of Dwarf Fortress succeeds where others fail, is that you have a party of dwarves, and each have their own personality elements. But you yourself are not a person in the game. I think that makes a difference because there's so many games where you play as the main character and you don't really identify with the character so much. You see what's going around the character instead of the character himself. So when you have a game focused on one character, it's hard to tell a good story around that one person. But if you have a group of people, like in the main mode of Dwarf Fortress, then you have interactions between people, and that's the sort of the interesting thing story-wise, is interactions between different people. You never really get a really compelling story about one person. It's always about multiple people.
In Dwarf Fortress, I mean, we've kind of changed over time what you are as the player. Right now, we call it sort of you are the official will of the community or whatever, and you set kind of the official goals, and you can act through individual dwarves through official actions or something. And it's not. There are gray areas, of course, all through that, and it is one of those things where if it's fun to kind of micromanage the combat a little bit, then that'll be in or whatever. and a lot of not fun micromanagement to boot. But anyway, you have these dwarves that you're watching doing things, and you can just sit there and watch them, and it's in adventure mode. It gets back to kind of to what I was saying about having a world for you to bounce off of. If you've got your character and now you can have, say, a brother who's the actual brother of your character, you've got parents, you live in a town, and all those kind of things that you'd have in a plot game just naturally because the guy just pulled it out of his head. You'd be like, yeah, I think the guy should have a brother, and they live in this town, and you can just kind of say a bunch of sentences and establish a whole world's worth of facts just in a few sentences about where you're from and so on, that would just come off cheap in a procedural game, because it would be like, as it is now in Dwarf Fortress, like, I have a brother from this town and these are our parents. And when you talk to him, if you're lucky, he'll be like, hello, brother. And it's like, nice to see you.
Exposition's very hard to do.
Yeah, and that's gonna be we keep telling ourselves, and we're slowly working on it, that those are the main things we want to focus on now that we have it. Knows who your brother is, it knows all the stuff. You can just work on the exposition, but it's still so difficult to tackle problems like voice. If you want to have the characters not sound like other characters, they have to not sound like other characters, right? And you can partially handle that through the personality generator, but then are you sitting there writing 4,000 lines of dialogue or whatever? And it becomes a very large and difficult problem. I mean, people have suggested that we should just kind of do all of the dialogue in without showing actual quotations, but just saying, like, your brother says something cheerful or something like that. And it's a possibility, but I think that also has its problems of pulling you out of the situation. So, and we're going to try our best, but I think these are just difficult problems that come easier. Not to say it is easy, but they come easier to a writer because they can just write without having to worry about making it fit a template that's kind of staring at them that was generated from space. But the strength of having those things ready to use when you're trying to generate your narrative is you don't have to worry about plot consistency problems. Those are only going to come through bugs, but you'll be able to have all that stuff at your fingertips. Who's related to who, what kind of loyalties they have, where they're from, where they are right now. The timeline's always consistent. We have these things that are strengths, and they're not just strengths in terms of the bookkeeping, which is fine, but not really that compelling, but more like what can surprise you. Something can come out of seemingly nowhere, but it all fits. Everything fits. There's no kind of plot deus ex machina or whatever. I can't speak these Latin phrases, but where things just come to make things work and kind of pulled out of someone's ear. When things work for us, they work, and it all has a good reason. Everything ties up. I mean, I can sit here and talk about it, but we're just not that far along yet. And so you just have hope. You have hope that what you're doing is going to work, and it seems like it's going all right. But it's just not compelling enough to have people sit down and play adventure mode forever and stop eating and stuff like they're supposed to.
The day will come. But I think it's interesting what you're saying about the conversation, because there's an example, what I think of one of the big problems with procedural storytelling is I like to throw in the word uncanny valley wherever I can. But with procedural narratives, this is a big thing. The closer you try to get to an actual written book style of thing, or an actual sort of straight exposition thing, people can see the hand of the computer rather than someone actually writing dedicated things. The closer you try and get to really solid things, the more flawed it appears. Whereas if you have a much more abstracted thing, and I think Dwarf Fortress as it is very abstracted, but it works because it's abstracted and people fill in the details themselves. Boat Murdered, I think, is a great example of this. Boat Murdered is this very famous story of several players doing sort of round robin, passing the fortress between each other and telling their own perspective of what's happening in the game. And they will have a child that wants to create some great artifact, and this happens in the game. It never really tells you a big long spiel about the motivations of this child and its needs, but the people who were playing the game invented these motivations in their head and wrote about it in their story. And I think when you give just light touches, light details, little elements here and there, people fill in a much more solid narrative in their heads without you needing to give that and ending up with something much more crude and much more crass. So I think when it comes to procedural narratives, you do have to be aware of this uncanny valley and getting the balance of detail at the right point where people are filling in the details themselves instead of spotting the flaws in the output themselves.
I think that probably functions as a good example too, as a kind of counterpoint to conversation, because and they are already in a lot of motivations for why people make the artifacts. If they're more unhappy, they're more likely to murder a dwarf, for instance, and turn him into a bone chair rather than. And so that would fit with everything you've seen about that dwarf. He's had the unhappy arrow on him for a while, and then he goes off and kills somebody, makes a chair instead of making a little scepter out of rubies or something. So you can there's a lot more room on the motivation kind of complexity meter before you slip down into like staring some weird mannequin in the face that unsettles you or whatever with the uncanny valley. Whereas with conversation, you're kind of there all the time in terms of it being horrible and uncanny. So I think that's probably why Conversation Engine, despite it being on my mind all the time, has just not been a focus. We can get a lot more out of underlying personality mechanics that give rise to behaviors in a consistent fashion than you can out of trying to give voice to those. But that's just one example of what the problems are going to be like in adventure mode, because adventure mode is essentially a camera sitting inside of fortress mode, shining light and looking at every little detail from the worst possible perspective. You do have to rely on the ability of the player to wing it and try and not get in their way too much, but it's unavoidable to have to deal with the conversation problem. But I think people start to recognize the cues and just kind of blow through a conversation and get back into adventuring. On the other hand, the problem is things like jokes. Jokes are horrible. Like you ask the child right now, when you ask a child what their profession is, you say, "Well, you look like a powerful warrior indeed," and the child says, "I'm 3" or whatever, and arguably mildly amusing the first time. And then after that, every child says the same thing. You drop the same line every time, and you just want it to just go back to a regular profession question or whatever. So and then you're confronted with the choice of, do you make like the random quip generator and burn a lot of time on that and end up with some half-assed system, or just kind of move on and work on other things. But you definitely get a lot further in dwarf mode. I think there's a lot further we can go in dwarf mode and still not break anybody's suspension of disbelief. It's like you're always staring at the characters moving through your uncanny valley, these kind of almost human things. You're always staring at them from so far away that it either looks abstract or it looks human, depending on it never looks. I mean, it looks bad when it gets really bad, like when someone's motivation completely doesn't make sense, or someone does something stupid like walking into a fire or something like that. Just that's when you hit the uncanny valley for dwarf mode, or possibly not the uncanny valley, just like way away from being on the scale at all. That was just dumb.
I think like the ASCII display. Well, it's not ASCII; it's sort of extended ASCII. But this abstract display also helps the whole thing. You don't have to worry too much about like an emu taking up more size in a space than a dwarf and things like that. And some of the interactions you see on the map, they're also abstract, that you can build up a narrative in your head around them happening without worrying too much about whether that actually makes sense in the real world. I think ASCII is one of there's a great power to it in getting away from that uncanny valley and letting procedural narrative work much more freely by the interactions of these abstract elements.
Yeah, well, as you know, that's a dicey subject when you get into whether or not you should use tiles, for instance, or whether or not you should go for a larger graphics. I mean, to me, it's mostly a development decision just because it's so fast. We tried our 3D graphics, and there were some very uncanny valley pictures there of some horrible faces that I wouldn't call them uncanny valley pictures. Actually, I would call them bad pictures, because uncanny valley is about something looking almost human, but not quite.
Yeah.
And our pictures were bad, rather than almost human. So to us, it's just about development speed, and also, I mean, that we're not great artists. But I think a lot of people just can't do the ASCII, and I don't think it has anything to do with, some people throw about like lack of imagination or that kind of thing. It's not that. It's just some people prefer graphics, some people don't process the ASCII as well. I, for instance, I haven't talked to anyone with dyslexia, for instance. Does that just not work?
We've checked that. We've checked that, and dyslexia is not an issue.
Yeah, so that's off the thing. I know red-green color blindness is an issue, a big one, and I mean you had a show about that kind of thing recently. What I'm saying is that it's important not to delegitimize the concerns of people that want graphics in the game, and we try to support that a bit. I mean, we've been lagging on that, but people with who've written utilities that make the game isometric now, so it's like it's out of our hands pretty much. And there are things we can do, but people are way ahead of where we'd ever get if we tried. So I think I mean, I always play in ASCII. That's my preference.
I think there is this general split of, if you can take the ASCII and you can learn to love it, you'll love it. But some people, it's not for them. It just isn't, and I don't think anyone should ever be judged for that. And I think there is a problem amongst Dwarf Fortress and roguelike players of some people looking down on those that use graphics. I think that's a shame to have that sort of opinion. It's good when games like Dwarf Fortress can support both communities.
Yeah, now we just need to get to the usable interface community.
Yeah, you've got a little bit of a range to go.
That's another roguelike tradition.
Yeah. Have you seen much about Clockwork Empires by Gaslamp Games?
I just heard it was a project that said that they took some inspiration from Dwarf Fortress. I don't know anything else about it other than that it will have mega projects.
It looks quite interesting. It's from the guys that made Dungeons of Dreadmore, who, I mean, their goal with Dungeons of Dreadmore was to take roguelikes and make them more accessible. And they're pretty successful with that. And one of their stated goals with Clockwork Empires, they don't want to just duplicate Dwarf Fortress or compete with Dwarf Fortress, but they want to try and make something akin to Dwarf Fortress that would be accessible to a wider audience. Got some interesting ideas. I'm curious to see how well that works out.
Yeah, I mean there are an awful lot of games that I haven't tried. And Paradox just put one out. Is it out? It might have been out a few days ago. It was Game of Dwarves, and there's No Moria and all these things that I don't know if they really took off at all. And some people from our forum were writing a game called Towns, which is kind of I think it's isometric take on it, and so there are things like that. The city building part, it kind of reminds me of Dungeon Keeper or something. That's like the city building part. People have kind of tried to do that. I'm not sure if is that the focus of the Gaslamp Games ones as well, the dwarfy part rather than the kind of world or adventure part.
Yeah, they don't have an adventure part. They've just got the sort of community building, like sim style of gameplay, with various interactions based on that.
Yeah, it should be cool if you can do various crazy things, and that seemed to be one of their focuses.
Yeah, they're talking about having Lovecraft style horrors and all that sort of thing, and citizens that go mad and things like that, which always helps to make things more fun. But there are a few others trying Dwarf Fortress likes, as you might call them, and I've not seen anything really successful. Probably because obviously Dwarf Fortress has been going 10 years now, whereas a lot of these projects are a lot more recent and possibly have less dedicated people involved. Yeah, I've yet to see anything that really replicates or comes near to replicating Dwarf Fortress, but I have seen a great many people making roguelikes or similar games that are quite clearly influenced by the game. It's interesting, actually, I was talking to Michael Bro, the maker of Zaga 33, and he said that...
Zaga!
Yes. He said he originally was trying to make this ultimate roguelike, this whole idea of the ultimate simulation roguelike, with all sorts of complexity, etc., etc. But then when Dwarf Fortress came out, he saw that and thought, oh, I don't need to bother anymore. Someone's done this already. The world has its perfect simulationist game. I'm going to move on to other things. And he's created lots of other great things, so that's all well and good. I kind of wish with some of the other developers that they would take the same attitude, because a lot of them aren't approaching design in a very sustainable way. They're just thinking, I want to make a big, huge game.
Yeah, it's too bad because I want to play some big, huge games. It's like, what about us?
Surely you're not bored of Dwarf Fortress?
Well, it's the thing that you've probably heard before when you try and program or play your own, when you try and play your own roguelike or play
Yeah.
your own game, that you had need to tweak something. You just need to tweak
Yeah.
something or whatever, and then
You get
and
5
it's
minutes
all
in
over.
and you're diving into the code.
Yeah,
You cannot
yeah.
possibly get through a whole game.
Yeah,
So
there's some big ones though. I mean, I haven't played them. There's like I haven't played Cataclysm. I don't know how big Caves of Cud is or how you say that.
Yeah.
Those seem to be bigger projects.
Yeah, Chaos
Uh,
Code is big. I don't think it's quite the same. Well, it's very much roguelike style, and much less of the simulation style. Though it looks very similar in certain ways to Dwarf Fortress, but it doesn't
yeah,
have
I wasn't saying there was an influence at all. I was just I was trying to think of epic projects, right?
Oh yeah, they've said they're influenced by Dwarf Fortress, and it's very obvious when you play the game. Yeah, it is a very big world. There are there's other projects like Ultimate Ratio Regnum trying to make a big game. Cult RL trying to make something huge. Adom 2, again, it's supposed to be an adventure game where you can build your own settlements and so on. But these are all really immature projects. I think Goblin Camp is trying to be Dwarf Fortress like, but I've not seen much update on it lately.
Incursion was going for quite a while, wasn't it?
And then it stopped.
Oh, it stopped.
Yeah.
There was of course, I mean you can't if you're going to bring up Add-on 2, you might as well say that Crawl is still going or whatever. Crawl seems to be going strong.
Yeah, but Crawl is kind of in a steady state of tweaking itself, and sort of
They're still adding
its aim
octopodes and stuff.
Yeah, but it's not adding. They're not trying to be more complex. They're removing things as well as adding things. There's the whole furore over them removing mountain dwarves, for instance, which all the Dwarf Fortress fans were raging about. The Dwarf Fortress fans could not believe that you could take dwarves out of a game. How could you do that? We've seen a lot of these projects in the past, and they'll go things like Incursion, and they will look very promising, and they will start off, with this very complex thing, and then stop. Yeah, there's been quite a lot of it. I think Dwarf Fortress, I mean, it managed to. You got the release out in 2006, and it got enough attention, really, that you had people actually playing it, and that makes a big difference. When you get a decent number of people playing, giving feedback, providing suggestions, and then you feel compelled to do a lot more work. And when you've got something really playable, because I think a lot of these other games, they just haven't actually gotten to the stage of being playable.
Yeah, and I think that was important. Our first release was actually was playable, and so we didn't have the slightest idea how all this internet like forum culture and stuff worked. We didn't know anything about that because we had run a forum for 6 years, but it was such an invisible forum that we never really Armok never became popular anywhere because it was completely unplayable. So we just didn't even know about the existence of other forums. Didn't really know about the news sites or podcasts or anything like that. And when we put Dwarf Fortress out, we learned about all that stuff very, very quickly because the buzz just went everywhere. Being playable is very important.
I remember when it came out and going to your website and seeing something that looked like it was out of the early 90s and thinking, what the hell is this? And I know as roguelikers, we're not supposed to really be too worried about aesthetic, but when you've got, bright magenta text and flashing yellow text on bright backgrounds and all sorts of, tiled image backgrounds, and there's just the most ugly possible website you can imagine. No offense.
Well, I think a person going to the Dwarf Fortress website now would consider it ugly, maybe unless they're a roguelike player specifically, because it's just a giant ASCII image now.
It's better than it was. But I seem to have had that for quite a while as well. And I kept thinking, this game is so successful, can't they find someone with half decent web skills to make something barely presentable? But
well, people have sent us really nice looking web designs in the past, but when you become entangled with something like that and then they disappear and then you've got this other thing you don't really know how to work with. It's happened with my graphics code, for instance. Like we really wanted to port to Linux and Mac and just update our OpenGL because we use OpenGL to print the tiles and just to avoid some of the input problems that come with using like PD curses, which is what we had back then. There's all kinds of new stuff you guys talk about now. I don't have any idea what that stuff is. Lib this or that or whatever people seem to use now. But the update to the OpenGL, I was just completely unaware of all the evolving standards and all that kind of thing, and was using code that was deprecated and so on. And so on certain video cards that stopped supporting it, it was suddenly 10 times slower. So, and meaning that the title screen was 10 frames per second, which is bad. So Bon, someone from Norway, updated the code, and in so doing also allowed it. I also set up a Linux and Mac port using SDL. So now we've got Dwarf Fortress playable on a bunch of extra computers with up-to-date graphics code that runs quickly on all the modern video cards, or at least that's not the bottleneck anymore. I mean, you still might get 1 frame per second in your fort, but that's on me. But it runs nicely and all that. But now I've got, for myself, since he's moved on, I have impenetrable graphics code for me, right? So when it comes to like adding new item pictures or something like that, so allowing people to use their own item tiles and that kind of thing that people want, for me that's become a very difficult problem. So I've just taken as kind of a general principle, trying not to entangle myself on content or technical stuff too much with people. So I want to run my own website when I can, even if it looks bad. We run our own podcast and all that kind of stuff. It's all still handled on ourselves so that we can kind of make changes. It's probably it's a harmful attitude, I guess, in a lot of ways.
It is very hard to rely on internet people. They do just disappear. That's a serious problem across a lot of game projects where they rely on someone as a graphic artist or something like that. And it'd be good when you've got, say, a community that can get things together, but when you're relying on individuals, it becomes very tricky.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of independent people have started paying their artists. It's nice for them. So it's good
I've heard even with paid artists, you cannot rely. It's hard to find a paid artist that you can rely on. So even offering money, it's not so easy. So the future, you've talked about some of the things that you're working on with adventure mode. I mean, what's it like working on 10-year-old code? 'Cause you must still have some bits of your code that old.
Yes, there's code that I try not to look at, even though I should. And it's difficult, especially with a game where basically people would like to have a content update every day. And if they're not going to get one that they can play like a new release, then they definitely want it on the development log, right? And I am the same way. I want to do content updates all the time, right? And that includes things like fixing bugs, but refactoring code and so on is lower down on the list, although that of course leads to all sorts of problems. But we do have old code hanging around, and the only chance I usually get to work on it is when I'm completely gutting a system. So I'm completely gutting vegetation now and replacing it with like multi-tile trees and fruit that grows on the trees that can be picked and trees that can be climbed, all that kind of thing. And that was a good opportunity for me to go in and clean up some horrifying vegetation code that I've been kind of holding my hand over my eyes every time I go by it, just because it wouldn't be worth it to work on it when you know it's going to go away. So it's just, there's all kinds of time management issues and so on, but it's so the game is made out of all kinds of different pieces. And as I've learned things, like I didn't even know anything about object-oriented programming when I started, and I only put that in I don't remember the year now, but it was somewhere like halfway through the project. So when I updated to using, more derived classes and polymorphism and stuff where it would be really handy, it was kind of a sort of a nightmare at the time, and there are probably still bugs from that period. But it's also made the code a lot more resilient. So I have learned a lot of things that help the project survive and kind of future-proof it in ways that at least make it easy to work on. And also just having that graveyard of projects that I've been working on for decades is a lot of help in terms of just keeping the project going forward. And Dwarf Fortress has actually been getting a little bit faster recently with the last series of releases. We squeezed quite a bit out of it. I don't feel the same way I felt with Armok, where Armok felt like a rickety structure that I was adding to that was going to fall. at some point, and I was just used to thinking that way about projects because they'd all sort of die on me. But this feels a lot better, and it's just there's no worries at all about being able to add to it. I mean, I guess there are practical concerns, like we often butt heads now with the fact that it's still 32-bit, and people will regularly allocate 2 gigabytes of memory when they make their worlds and so on, and then their computer dies. Things like a 64-bit Dwarf Fortress and so on are necessary to keep things going. But relatively speaking, I feel good about the future. I don't remember if there was more of a question to that.
That was pretty much sort of it. And I mean, you rely on the project for your income, sort of the very generous community that's built up around it. Do you feel like you have to wear a sort of marketeer hat sometimes, or a business hat? Does that affect how you make the game?
It doesn't affect the game in sweeping. I mean, the direction of the project is the same as it would have been. I mean, that's kind of a no compromise thing, but there are things priorities that change and so on. Not just like my other games, believe it or not, are a lot more buggy than Dwarf Fortress, because I do pay more attention to that kind of thing, because there's people playing it and people care when a giant bug happens. Whereas when we only been releasing games for since 2000, and like I said, I've been working on games forever before that, so I'm used to just letting bugs sit, and if they don't particularly care about them, just let them go or whatever. And so we stopped doing that. Actually fix them. Interface concerns people have, I work on. And also, I'd like to bring up some content things like the animal sponsorship drive, obviously purely kind of community driven, but also an excuse for us to add tons of unnecessary animal content to the game. So it's like it all kind of works together there. But there's also aside from the programming, of course, there's things like, even talking on this program, I'm assuming I'm a bit of a different person than I would be if I wasn't trying to keep the game intact and keeping the community intact. But that probably just has more to do with off-color humor than anything.
Are there any side projects you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, back in, say, I don't know, 2007 or 8, we started working on taking time off at the end of the month and kind of working on what we called month-end project. And that went for a while, and then, of course, Dwarf Fortress kind of takes over, and, and then you're not working on the month-end project anymore, so you just got something sitting there. And there have been kind of revisits of that, splits of that, breaking up into pieces. So I'd say there are kind of several things that we're working on, but nothing we'd want to announce, because I don't want to build expectations. They're just as likely to die as see the light. I would say that's not among them. I don't think there's any standard fantasy project, so it's all kind of branching out. Maybe there's arguably one fantasy project, but so branching out into different genres and stuff. But I wouldn't feel too comfortable talking about it. Okay. Not because I'm really keeping secrets, but because people start to, there's hype around things, and I really can't guarantee any releases of anything but Dwarf Fortress from now on.
It's kind of interesting when you get someone that you are a celebrity programmer, essentially. Sort of, you are well known, and you're well known for one project, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee that the little things you work on for fun are going to be anywhere near the same or anywhere near as attractive to your core fan base. It's sort of interesting when you look at Notch, the maker of Minecraft, Notch. He takes part in different game jams and stuff, and there's kind of this expectation that he's going to make the next amazing game in this 2-day game jam. And this very, very unrealistic expectations there. But, he obviously does it just for fun, and he doesn't really care about the end product that much. But you get all this hype around it, and it's sort of, I can imagine that'd be quite annoying.
Yeah, people know how we operate, so obviously we've had our hand at making like the ultimate sci-fi game or the ultimate modern game or whatever. We kind of tried the different hats on back in the 90s, and the fantasy one is the one that fit the best. But that's not to say that we aren't still thoroughly interested in some of the projects we worked on back at that time. And I think I think they'd be things that would be interesting to people, but it's like I say, people get excited. So I don't know. Well, this has been something that we constantly grapple with, is like, how do we approach the fact that we have other things we're working on, and I don't really have any good answers right now, because it's like you say, there's an aspect in which I wouldn't say we're celebrity programmers, because people wouldn't really recognize our name on the street unless they've been accosted by my grandmother on the ferry boat, because she constantly bothers people about Dwarf Fortress. But
Really?
Yeah, she'll interrupt conversations and stuff. She's not that bad, but she had some funny stories. But it's just the kind of thing where I feel kind of oversensitive to hype after criticizing Spore and Oblivion and so on. I'd hate to be the source of anything myself or whatever. Yeah, it's also weird because living on, like you say, on one project, it is a very strange position to be in, because this is it, right? There's just the one project, and you can't really think about. We don't want to transition to another project, but it's like, even a small side project is going to be seen by certain people as a kind of abdication of our responsibilities to have been working those days or whatever. And I'm not that afraid about that kind of thing, because I think people are, for the most part, reasonable. But yeah, it's just when you say, have you ever worn the PR hat or the marketing hat? I mean, I guess this is where it's like, I would wear those hats, but I don't know any of the skills associated or how we should think about things or whatever. So we just kind of stay in this kind of status quo position.
Plus, you get about $3,000-4,000 a month.
Yeah.
It varies obviously quite a bit, but it's not like you have the millions that Notch has.
No.
Your community is very generous, but it's not. It's good to live on, but I presume you have to be aware of having pension plan and medical plan and all this sort of thing.
Or aware of not having them, yeah.
Or aware of not having them, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I don't live over there. There's nice places to live for that kind of thing.
Maybe you should be aware. But it's not that much money at the end of the day, in terms of when you consider a whole life, a whole career, and no certainty in the future, really.
Yeah. It always kind of stares you right in the face, because I had my math job, right? I was a kind of like a baby professor, like a postdoc for a couple of years, and I was sort of on that math track of just I coasted about as far as I could in math, basically. And for me, the stopping point was being like mega junior faculty or whatever. And I couldn't, there's people who are smarter than me, math wise, like a lot smarter than me math wise, that could continue to do what I was doing and kind of coast on math research and also write Dwarf Fortress at the same time. And I wasn't that person. So I had to make a decision about what I was going to do. And I left the math job, and I thought I didn't actually have a plan, because I quit a couple days before, a couple months before actually moved the quitting process in place a year before, and then actually quit a couple months before Dwarf Fortress was even released, because it wasn't working. The lifestyle wasn't working in general, and I had no idea it would actually be able to pay the rent. So that's just been one big, happy, fortuitous set of circumstances for me so far. And, we are only hoping that it's just going to keep going. And so far it has been kind of, it arrived at a level where things seem to be holding pretty stable, and it happens to be at a level where I can keep going. And people seem to be happy with how things are going. And so I'm less afraid about the future than maybe I was 5 years ago, but it still feels very uncertain overall. So it's like you can't be in my position and complain because I feel like we're really lucky and this is awesome. And a lot of people kind of want to write a computer game all the time, right? But at the same time, there's no guarantee at all that this is what we're going to be able to do 4 years from now. I mean, we know we've got a couple years that we can, even if the spigot just stops, we can keep going for a couple of years and hopefully find ways to keep it active. and kind of get people interested again or whatever happens. You know, I have no idea what the future scenario would be, but after that, you know, I have no idea, and I've just kind of assumed that I'm gonna go out like some kind of blues man and just not quit and not retire, and you know, just have some kind of catastrophic health incident, and then that's my healthcare plan right now. So.
The healthcare plan is to make sure that whatever situation you have is dramatic enough to have an
Yeah.
amazing exit.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you are in probably a completely unique position in the world.
It is strange.
There are lots of sort of indie developers that have made it with one game, and then they're continuing to work with other games. You have one game, and this is your big project, and you've been working on it many years now, and you've managed to make this sustainable because you do have this reasonably steady stream of income. There's no one else has that.
Yeah, I don't know if is that true anymore. I mean, I don't know. Is because Dark Gods seem to be picking up. I mean, the Tome.
He's got a full-time job.
Does he want to quit though and work on Tome?
I think he would like to, but he's not getting.
Does it seem to be?
He's not getting the sort of income he's getting about 600, 700 a month.
That's where I started though. I mean, he's been working long. He's been online longer than I have, but he just started with this thing, and so it seems to be picking up, and people seem to be liking the game and stuff. So
yeah, I mean,
hopefully that continues to work out because that'd be awesome.
I think he's approaching version 1 now, and then it's a case of moving on to the next project.
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting either way. But I mean, it's not. I mean, I'm just trying to think because it's not. I mean, it's not like it's that much different from having a Kickstarter or something. You can do it. I mean, you do it. It's kind of a one-time thing, and then you start selling your game. But it's still the same sort of busking with your instrument case out or whatever for a period of time anyway. Because I mean, you could look at it like we'd stop Dwarf Fortress now, have whatever kind of seed we have for ourselves, and just start the next project. So it's actually quite similar to the position a lot of other independents are in, except the revenue stream, I guess, on their games kind of has a tail to it, whereas ours is just this complete unknown that seems to have some stability right now.
I mean, most indie gamers will release, say, 3 projects a month. Or, sorry, 3 projects a year. Or they'll normally produce, say, 10 projects a year, 3 of which will be a financial success, and they'll continue in a cycle like that. I think at the moment, if you want to break even on iPad development, you have to be releasing about 18 games a year, in terms of what the average person gets.
Yeah, it really depends. I know one iPhone developer in the area, and he's got maybe 4 or 5 projects going. He kind of has like a flagship project he'll put out maybe every 6 or 8 months. But they are some of the bigger ones that come out there, and so he'll do well enough to keep going for another couple of years, and then come up with a few new kind of. But he wants to get over on PC and get on Steam Greenlight to see how that goes. So, it's gonna be interesting to see how all that stuff plays out. Yeah, and yeah, I don't know. I don't know much about any of this stuff. It's just all been crazy, and we never had to learn about publishers or advertising or like how to do a marketing campaign or anything. So it's like because people ask me, how to get in the position I'm in or whatever, and all I can tell them is to write a game, which isn't very good advice.
Well, actually, that's what every indie developer says. Go and make a game. You can't approach it with, what business stuff should I do? You have to make the game first, and if you're not really passionate about making games, you will not make money making games. Unless you're Zynga.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's not just Zynga. I mean, a lot of people make their careers on knockoffs. I mean, I didn't play. I'm going to say this without having played the game and without casting any particular aspersions, so I want to apologize in advance. But Fortress Craft, for instance, sounds like a game with a name that was like derived from 2 different games, Minecraft and Dwarf Fortress, and that was promising to be probably better than both of them. And I don't know if it succeeded, but I think perhaps there was a bit of cynicism there. Perhaps. And I believe they're financially successful. So it's like I mean, I would definitely tell anyone to have a dream and go, make the game that, within reason, that they can accomplish and get that out there. And people, it's kind of like the Field of Dreams movie or whatever. If you build it, they will come. But maybe they won't. I mean, it's hard to say, right? It's really hard to say, because there's a lot of good games that get utterly overlooked or whatever, and it just end up that way. And then there's a lot of crap derivative knockoffs that just copy stuff and so on, that make millions of dollars. So it's hard to say what's going to be successful, of course, or else more people would be doing that, I guess. But as for people getting into I mean, I wouldn't. I guess it's kind of a stupid thing to say overall, because it's like, sure, you can do something cynical and have a knockoff that makes a lot of money, but that would never be the advice you give to somebody if you want to feel like a human being.
Yes.
So yeah, I'll continue to spread a message of hope to people instead of telling them to go.
No upstanding dwarf would give such advice.
It's such it's so strange to be to be in a position giving advice or whatever. And it's like, because they teach more at places like DigiPen than I know about any of this stuff or whatever, and so I just feel completely unqualified to talk about it, because it's just a total fluke. I mean, the project's not a fluke. The project's the result of like a lot of hard work, but that anyone cared was the fluke. And it's like, you don't know. I
mean, my advice to anyone wanting to be in your position is give up, because you are a one-off, and this is not the right approach. Quitting your job and working full time on your game and hoping that's a really bad idea. And it's it's worked, but it's technically, logically speaking, a terrible idea.
That's true. Although I did keep the job until Dwarf Fortress was. I mean, I had it sitting in front of me, and at least I knew it was okay at the time. It's like it wasn't completely playable or anything, and anyone who played the 2006 releases knows it was completely buggy and stuff. It was just kind of bad that way, but you could tell that it was okay and had some new stuff in it. So you can get your game to that point where you think that you've got something special, and you'll know, because you see all the games that are out there. You know that you've got something different, and then you can quit your job. Then at that point you should quit your job and release your video game.
Just wanted to bring up one other point of controversy. Is about Windows 8. I don't know if you know much about it.
I don't know much about it. I'm always afraid to move to the next operating system, because it's going to kill something in your game and you have to work on bugs for a while and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is there something even worse?
Yeah, it's this whole new Windows Store. There's been a lot of controversy in indie circles about this. I think it's something probably you and Dwarf Fortress fans should be worried about as well, in that Windows will now be split into sort of the Windows 8 desktop style and the Windows 8, what they call the Metro style. Actually, they don't call it the Metro style anymore, but it's basically the Windows RT, the setup for touch interface style. And on the touch interface style, which is the default setting and the only setting on tablets, you can only have applications on it that are Microsoft certified, which involves paying a Microsoft certification subscription fee and signing up to Microsoft terms and conditions, and all sorts of extra things, including restrictions like not having mature content and not referencing other people's works, or various of these application restrictions that I think iOS has at the moment already, but Windows is now adopting this very strict thing as well.
That's odd, because I can release on the Mac.
Yeah, but you can release on the Mac, but whoever's on the Mac has to make sure they've got in the menu settings it unticked that accept from other developers. The big thing about the Windows thing is that you'll be able to release to it, and people on desktops will be able to play it. They will get big warnings saying this looks like this is an uncertified program. We do not recommend you using it. It's really quite harsh warning message. And at the same time, they are not giving you access to modern OS features. It feels like the big warning for a lot of people is that this is like when DOS was split off from Windows back in the 90s. And DOS, the traditional desktop Windows is going to be cut away in the future entirely. And we will only have this Windows Store approved apps.
There's going to be the pressure of people who can't play Dwarf Fortress. So we'll have 300 or 400 people yelling at him. That's what I can marshal.
I hope they do yell about this because it's a
It's
big
yeah,
concern.
it's like yeah, no, it sounds like the same kind of typical horrible evil crap that goes on all the time. And yeah, I mean we can just try and weather the storms, and if the computers as we know them completely cease to exist, we'll have to adapt or hope that people use Linux.
This business with Windows 8, yeah, we'll see how that plays out. A lot of people are really upset about it. Gabe Newell of Valve is like just almost spitting mad.
Well, it's kind of ironic that he's annoyed that Windows are wanting to take a 30% cut of all titles released on it.
Yeah, well, Windows is welcome to 30% of my sales costs. But it's I mean it's the thing when you get like free to download things certified, it's not going to be about the percentage, it's just going to be about the fee. They're like 2,500 to certify. And it's like,
Well,
well,
it's $100 with an annual subscription fee of another $100, I believe.
Yeah.
So it's not huge, but there's other problems as well.
yeah.
Same as Apple's iOS fee.
Yeah, it's similar.
Now the thing that's interesting, I mean, I haven't noticed this problem with Macs because like if you put Dwarf Fortress on my Mac Mini, there's no pop-ups, no kind of like don't play this. It just lets you run it. And no one's ever complained to me about any of this stuff.
Which version of OS X are you on?
We've gotten people up to 10 point whatever the one is now. I mean, it's not like we're playing it on a phone. A lot of this stuff, the bad stuff, all the certifications seems to be for phone stuff. But I wouldn't. I mean, it's not like I'd be surprised if all of a sudden all of their kind of non-phone larger computers suddenly acted like their phones, right? I mean, that seems to be the way things are going. But there's still room for desktops in the world, hopefully, or at least laptops that act like desktops. There's still people who program and so on in the world.
Yeah.
Lots of them. And I don't know if they're all just going to have to move to Linux, or these people realize that they're shooting themselves in the foot for no good reason.
Well, I'm hoping they'll realize they're shooting themselves in the foot because the big attraction to Windows has been the open system. And so many of the games and the programs we rely on are not Microsoft certified and are perfectly safe. Well, yeah, the latest version of OS X, Mountain Lion, I think it is, by default doesn't allow uncertified programs. You can go into the settings, you can change it. It's not that hard.
Yeah, maybe all the people that kind of download Dwarf Fortress and then bother to write me about it are kind of already done that or something, because
very likely
they're on the internet and downloading things, so they've obviously had this problem a million times before. So yeah, I haven't heard about it, but because I haven't updated to the newest version. Hopefully I won't have to. That's always expensive.
Well, yeah, it's a worry amongst a lot of developers. I was wondering if you'd heard of that.
No, and there's not. I mean, yeah, it's like I can do so little about these things. I usually just let them hit me when they come. It's not a very smart thing, but what can I do?
Yeah, true. The other thing about this certification thing is you have to be one of 120 countries to take part in it. If you live in Bosnia, for instance, you cannot make games for Windows anymore.
Oh, that's
and there's all sorts of really horrible things like that. And like in the same way that Apple can remove apps without any reasoning, Windows will be able to do the same in the future. That's quite.
Yeah, I don't know why they want to go down that road. That's just bonkers.
Yeah, because I'm annoyed enough with it at Apple at the moment. To see Windows taking this on is really quite depressing.
Yeah, I mean, it's like people had talked about Microsoft being evil and so on, but yeah, it's like when you actually hear about the Mac stuff, it always seemed worse to me. And Microsoft just had lots of bad stuff, and Linux was just used by too few people, even if it was cool or whatever. And yeah, but that's going to be, especially for the roguelike people, because there's so many kind of 7-day people and stuff now all over the world in every country you could name or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really annoying.
But yeah, hopefully it won't be a problem. I mean, I personally take the rule that only upgrade to Windows every second release.
Yeah,
they seem to screw it up. So so perhaps Windows 8 will just be crap, and then Windows 9 will be perfectly fine. But
yeah, I'm fortuitous that I think there are 3 computers in this house right now, and they're all running 7. Yeah. And I just hope they live for a long time, because I Well, I update my operating system when I get a new computer, when my computer completely craps out, and I'm just on whatever I, get saddled with, unless I mean, I've stopped installing XP. I used to install XP over Vista, but now 7 seems fine.
Yeah.
And it's safer on the internet and so on, because XP is at the point where it's like you just look the wrong way on the internet and someone's got something ready for you or whatever, because it's been out there for 20 years or whatever. Or 12 or something. I don't know. XP's been out a long time. So I finally had to give it up.
Just to get back to Dwarf Fortress, I mean, like we said, there's this unique thing, but it's something very special. It's quite cool that you've got this community supporting you on this. I think it's good that we can have these nice things in the world. That otherwise this is not really a marketable product in many ways.
That's true.
I could not. Well, if it didn't have its history and you were to submit it to Steam Greenlight right now, it would not have a fecking hope. But yeah, you've got a fantastic community built around this, and it's really helped make a beautiful thing become even better.
Yeah, they've been awesome. No, it's more than I could have possibly imagined when we released it. The way that people just kind of came by and wanted to help with everything. And I mean, there's people that do just the lion's share of the work on the bug tracker now, and like I said, the guys. There's been multiple guys working on port type stuff over the years. It's just amazing what the internet has made all of this possible. It's just crazy. It's unimaginable. I mean, we had been writing games forever and just never thought about. I mean, one of the reasons that Dwarf Fortress is still kind of such a rough thing to play is, I mean, we just never were in the mindset where we're releasing games for other people to play. Right? They were just for our friends. Forever. I mean, started working on them when I've been programming forever. So like, by which I mean like 5 or 6, introduced to BASIC and making things move across the screen and so on. Just writing games ever since then. You have, games are really cool, but I had 1 friend, 2 friends maybe that played them. AOL came around and we put out this really crappy board game that nobody played, and no one wrote us back or anything. And so we're like, okay, whatever. And started to just keep working on our games. Then all of a sudden in 2000, it's like, that's when, I mean, the internet has been around a little before that as far as people massively using it in public. But that's when I put up my first web page, and then all of a sudden it's like, now I've got 200 people playing the game. And then in 2006, put out a game that you can actually play for once. And there's just this massive explosion of people. It's still something I can't really wrap my head around as far as, what people are willing to do, because I mean the people that it's just they've gone well beyond what I'd imagine, because I mean you're so used to people paying like $20 for a game these days or something, or just expecting it to be free to play, and then you get like perks if you want to buy like super coins and buy a hat or something, right? And it's like but there's still a lot of people out there who are really willing to do anything to make something work. It's just awe-inspiring.
I just want to end on one note, which just a reflection of your lifestyle. When I first contacted you about a time set up for this, I believe it's coming up to 8 a.m. your time, right? Now,
7, yeah.
7, yeah, okay. So it's getting late for you.
Yeah,
to your normal schedule. Yeah. Just to quote you exactly, lately I've been getting up around 4 p.m. and going to bed 8 a.m. So from 1 a.m. to 8 a.m. my time would be best. What a lifestyle. This sounds like a dream to me. I can't stand being awake before 4 p.m. Unfortunately, I have a 9 to 5 job, so I have to be. But... Yeah. I think the downsides we've found, not having the regular kind of work schedule now is really only been, I need to go to the bank today. I need to shop for something today. Things like that. And then the stores are closed. It's especially bad around here because stores on the weekends especially tend to close at like 6 o'clock or something. And so if you want to go somewhere, it suddenly becomes like a shopping adventure. It's like, I need to get up at 4:30 and then just get out there quick before the store closes or whatever. It's like, thank God my bank stays open till like 6:30 on Friday, just one day. But I have to plan around getting up on that day to get to the bank. Or what happens more often is,
Oh, I need to go to the bank, so I gotta stay up till 10 today. Go to the bank,
Yeah.
go to bed. Because like staying up for 10 for me is like a regular person with a regular schedule. I mean, staying up till like, 11, no big
Yeah.
deal. So, yeah, I can stay up till 10. It's just weird though, because it's not quite the same because when you go out to like do some errand at 10 o'clock and you're a little past your bedtime, the sun will totally try and reset you. Just the sun shining down on you, and then you try to go to bed. And I've got my window locked off with this kind of board with like some metal foil on it, so that no sunlight gets into my bedroom. And so I think I've avoided a lot of the kind of light sleeping or sleep problems you can get trying to sleep during the day. It really is just pitch black in there, and it works really well. And plus, it's behind the blinds, so I don't look creepy. Because I've seen you walk by the window sometime that have the metal foil just pointing out at the world or whatever, and so I've managed to have a sense of decorum as well.
Living the dream, Tarn.
Yeah, that's certainly getting my time now rather than building toward a bright future.
Well, I must admit, I am jealous. Thank you very much for joining the episode. It's been really great having you on. Very insightful hearing about Dwarf Fortress, and we look forward to what happens in the future.
Yeah, lots of big trees, climbing, jumping, running jumps, running and jumping, rescuing kidnapped children from goblin sites and bringing them back to their parents. Yeah, stuff like that. It'll be cool. The next release is going to be awesome, but it won't be for a while.
We'll be patient.
Have to be patient.
Well, for those listening, next week we're going to be talking about graphics and tile design in Roguelikes, and we've got a few quite well-known graphics artists on for that episode. So tune in for that. But for now, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Ciao, folks.